In this video, we will talk about spelling errors. Spelling errors occur when the letter sequence that is produced is not the same as the conventional way of spelling the word. But not all differences are the same. Not all differences have the same importance or meaning. And it is very useful to go into a qualitative analysis of spelling errors in order to understand where specific weaknesses might be or what stage of reading and spelling development the child is at. Let's work through some examples. So imagine that the word table, the table, is dictated in this word dictation task. So one expects the child to write Bura. If the child produces this letter sequence, this is problematic because they haven't picked the appropriate letter here. The word they wrote says something else. If you read this out aloud, it doesn't say Bura, it says Dura. So this may be an indication that the child is not yet sufficiently familiar with the graphophonemic mappings and may mix up their letters. This is something that is commonly seen and expected in relatively early stages, but should not be observed frequently after the child has developed their reading and spelling to some degree. If you see this in fourth grade, this would be a very serious and worrisome error. Or a child may produce this letter sequence. If you read this, it actually sounds the same as the intended word. Although this is incorrect by the convention, it is phonologically accurate. So in this sense, you can say that this child has mastered the graphophonemic mappings, is correctly applying the alphabetic principle, and lies stably at the alphabetic phase if this kind of, at least this kind of performance is seen throughout the spelling test. Still, this indicates that the conventions of spelling aren't mastered. So the child doesn't know how to spell this word. The child knows how to spell phonemes. So you get a very good indication about what the child has mastered and what the child has not yet mastered. If the child produces this word like that, then you can see that the child is familiar with this root. The child knows that table requires a silent D, but maybe isn't yet familiar with the convention of spelling the definite ending with a silent T. This also sounds correct if you pronounce it, although it looks incorrect. But this indicates that either the child doesn't understand that different parts of the words refer to different properties, so that this part should indicate the definite form of the noun, or that the child may understand that but not know that the definite form is spelled with a silent T, may not have separated the different kinds of endings in terms of their spelling requirements. But still, you see that this child is already internalizing the fact that certain words are written with certain patterns, even though they're not phonologically motivated. So there's no D in this word, yet a D letter must be produced when spelling it. So that's something that must be learned about this word family. Another way to spell this word would be to get the suffix correct, which indicates that there is knowledge about this morphological aspect of the word, that the definite form of neuter nouns requires a silent T, but the root of this word is not yet known. So the convention of the silent D when it comes to this word family is not internalized. Or of course, someone may actually produce the only one conventionally correct form. So if you were scoring a spelling test, this would get 1 point, and all of these would get 0 points. And that would be fine as long as you're only interested in the overall level of spelling development. But if there is a spelling difficulty and you need to know where you should intervene, these kinds of errors are very different, and the difference is very important because you would begin at completely different places if you saw this compared to if you saw this. Because they suggest that there are different kinds of information that are missing, whereas some of the elements have been mastered and you can work with them. Here's another example of the same sort. So you are dictating the word Billy and you expect this to be written. The first example here is actually phonologically inaccurate. If you read this, it doesn't sound like Billy, it sounds Billy. So it has the wrong vowel. It has a long vowel there. So it is the same kind as this error from this point of view, but it concerns a much more demanding aspect of Norwegian orthography because you spell the vowel in part by how you represent the consonant. So although these two kinds of error are both phonologically inaccurate, this one is something you expect to stop seeing earlier. So if you see this, it indicates a great problem compared to this one, which you expect to stop seeing later because it concerns a more demanding aspect of the system and so may persist for a longer time. Another kind of mistake you can see is an incorrect representation of the double consonant. So instead of a double L, you may get an LD here. And I made this example on purpose because I am sure most of you are going to protest that this is not phonologically accurate. You're going to protest that if you were shown this letter sequence, you would probably read it as bildi with a D in it. But that's not how we assess the phonological accuracy of words unless there are very clear rules that preclude that reading. As far as I can tell, and according to my dictionaries, the LD sequence is not infrequent in representing the L sound in this kind of context. So you get these words. And if you are to object that it's the vowel, the following vowel that makes the difference, well, you still see this LD with the silent D before consonants and before following vowels that are parts of suffixes. So this is a plausible spelling of L after a short vowel, even though you would probably read this with a D if you were to see it. It still is a plausible grapheme because it occurs in actual words in the language. So if the child is familiar with some of these, it is reasonable to extend and generalize and use the LD instead of the double L to represent the short vowel here. So it's still a mistake. This is definitely a spelling error. The question is whether it is a phonologically accurate or inaccurate spelling error. And to judge that, you have to take into account what spelling patterns are plausible in the language. Then you may have missing information that results in this silent consonant being dropped. This concerns word class. So the grammatical type of this word, that it is an adjective, And adjectives of this sort are spelled with a silent G. Or that part may be correct, but knowledge of the particular root may be incorrectly represented. Or the word can be entirely correctly spelled. So again, this would be the only response that would get a point in a spelling test. But all of these that would be scored with 0 are worth analyzing to determine what kinds of problems there are. Now, you can't draw such grand conclusions on the basis of just one word or even two words. You need to examine the results of a spelling test in their entirety and identify common patterns, as they're the ones that will give you more confidence in concluding what is mastered and what isn't. Isolated individual mistakes may be the result of a momentary distraction or of a writing difficulty or of something else. But the overall picture of a spelling test tends to be quite clear as to what the problems are and what is already achieved. Fortunately, you have a very good guide to take you through classification of spelling errors in a principled manner that can be very informative. Feinbach has come up with a classification scheme for spelling errors specifically tailored to the properties of the Norwegian language, which she used to classify the spelling errors in the tests of very many children and identify which areas are most demanding, most challenging for the children. So the first and most important distinction in this classification system, and indeed in every classification system, is whether they are phonologically inaccurate or phonologically accurate. So is the letter sequence that is produced by the child pronounced in the same way as the intended word? If yes, then the spelling pattern is phonologically accurate. This doesn't mean it's correct, but it's phonologically accurate, so it goes into this category. And there's more of this on the next page. If it's not phonologically accurate, then it goes into this category and is further classified into specific subcategories. These subcategories are based on the properties of Norwegian orthography, and so can help identify areas of particular difficulty. So there are some kinds of errors that are universally seen in alphabetic writing, such as exchanges or reversals and so on, or using the wrong graphemes. And there are some things that are more specific to Norwegian, like especially the double consonants and the spelling of the retroflexes with the letter R before another consonant. When it comes to phonologically accurate spellings, there are again different subcategories, in every one of which the word sounds correct but looks wrong because, for example, the child has chosen the incorrect option out of a number of ways to spell a given phoneme. The child may not be aware of a specific exception to a systematic mapping. The child may have left out a silent letter and these kinds of things. Here are more errors of this sort. Note that there is also a double consonant category here, and the important difference is that these kinds of double consonant misuse do not result in incorrect pronunciation. So there are either exceptions or other kinds of consonant doubling that do not belong to the previous category. For example, this is an exception because it is pronounced with a short vowel but doesn't require a double consonant to indicate it. And this kind of spelling, although phonologically accurate, is in fact a spelling error. And there are different kinds of mistakes one can make without altering the phonological form of the word. The next categories aren't strictly speaking spelling errors, especially here where it is incorrect choice of word. But there are things that one encounters when looking at the results of spelling tests for children, especially when you dictate a whole passage, because the children may misunderstand what they're hearing and so write a different word. So they're included in this classification system because you have to do something with all the mistakes, although they're not really spelling mistakes. I strongly suggest that you become very familiar with this entire classification system and that you learn to use it for your own work with children and apply it whenever you have a spelling sample from a child so that you have additional reliable cues to the level that the child has mastered and the areas of remaining weakness. In Finbach's study, there was another important comparison after this classification, which concerns the kinds of spelling errors seen by good spellers and poor spellers. So even good spellers make some spelling errors occasionally because there are orthographic challenges in the system. There are plenty of inconsistencies and exceptions, and so most people will make an occasional spelling error even if they're good spellers. There are many important things to note in the findings of this study, which are completely consistent with what we know from other languages, and just extend these ideas to the specific of Norwegian orthography. The first thing to notice is that the poor spellers make many more mistakes than the good spellers. Of course, this is not surprising, but the scale is important to understand. The differences are very, very big. The second thing to note is that the phonologically inaccurate mistakes are largely restricted to the poor spellers. There are very, very few cases of phonologically inaccurate errors made by good spellers. This is consistent with the idea that spelling reflects the level of reading development, and a solid understanding of the alphabetic principle precedes internalization of the conventions of the system. So what this means is that the good spellers are good readers, and good readers have completely internalized the alphabetic principle and all the mappings before they can learn all the special conventions and the exceptions and all that stuff. So you don't expect good readers to make any of these kinds of mistakes, at least not often. So these are extremely few. They concern an earlier level of reading and spelling development. The other important thing to note is that the kinds of errors made by the good and poor spellers aren't different. So those categories in which you see most of the errors made by the poor spellers are the same categories in which you see most of spelling errors made by the good spellers. Of course, there is a huge difference in the number, but when you look at mistakes by good spellers, you see that they tend to occur where the bars for the poor spellers are quite high. This is because what is difficult and challenging in an orthographic system is the same for everyone. It's more challenging if you're a poor speller because you're still behind in your spelling development, but qualitatively speaking, it's the same things that are challenging. So what we see here as most persistent, the kinds of mistakes that are, relatively speaking, most often seen in good spellers, they concern special selection of graphemes and exceptions. So it's the learning of how particular word families are conventionally represented, with which graphemes or combinations of graphemes and silent letters and these kinds of things are the most enduring problems with the orthography for good spellers. For poor spellers, in addition, an extremely challenging category is the double consonants. So this is the most challenging aspect of the Norwegian orthography, to master the fact that vowel length is indicated by the following consonants. So this picture is very important because it shows you what you can expect, and then combining these findings with our understanding of the stages of reading and spelling development can help us interpret the areas that are mastered and the areas that need further support for a given child.